Hello, my name is Jennie Dubin Rhodin, and I'm here to talk to you about my book, The African American Experience in the Slate Belt. I'd like to thank the Slate Belt Heritage Center for giving me the opportunity to write this book, and Sonia Pin for starting this project several years ago. I would also like to thank the Bloodworth family for the invaluable interviews they did for this book, and the Smith-Bodhi family for writing the book, A Giant in the Earth, concerning their ancestor, Jacob Benjamin Smith, and his wife, Mary Gertrude Smith-Bodhi. A Black community has existed in the area since 1730, when we have 5 enslaved individuals living in what was then known as the Hunter Settlement and is now known as Upper and Lower Mount Bethel. A good sense of the situation of African American individuals in Pennsylvania comes to us in 1790 during a census in which it becomes apparent of just how small the community was in Pennsylvania. Less than 1% of the Pennsylvania population was enslaved versus Virginia, where it was almost 40%. This isn't exactly surprising due to the various religious groups that made up Pennsylvania, including the Quakers, who were very much against slaves. In 1780, Pennsylvania enacted the Act for Gradual Abolition of Slavery. However, the act did only serve to free a few slaves, as noted by Melissa Driven of the Pennsylvania Inquirer, who can be quoted as saying the gradual terms were no godsend. Speaking of abolition, there have long been rumors of an underground railroad stop somewhere within the Slate Belt. However, there's no official record of such a location. However, that doesn't mean there wasn't one. Sometimes things don't make their way into official record or are purely passed down orally. In some cases, it is also a matter of things were simply lost or destroyed over time, which has happened in several cases, such as when churches are burnt down or historic documents are simply lost between going from, say, a church to a historic society or going to a county record location. Preceding the Act for Gradual Abolition of Slavery by almost 40 years is the first school opened for African Americans run by Richard Bolton. In 1758 was the first all African American school, which was opened by the Bray Associates. In 1770, Anthony Benza opened an African American school attached to a Quaker school. However, this is not surprising because he had been teaching out of his home since 1750. Pennsylvania also possesses 2 of the oldest historical Black colleges, Chanyeon University and Lincoln University. The Chanyeon University was the first African American historic school to join the Pennsylvania public system. Lincoln University would follow in 1859. Lincoln University would follow them in 1972, after which they'd been private for much of their life. 2 famous graduates of Lincoln University were Langston Hughes of class 1929 and Thurgood Marshall, the first Black Supreme Court Justice in 1930. In 1873, Lewis Brown sued the Wilkes-Barre School District in an effort to get his children enrolled in the schools. Lewis Brown successfully sued and it would not be until Brown v. Board of Education almost 100 years later that American schools would be forced to totally desegregate. It's very appropriate, however, that both of these cases had the last name Brown associated with them, since, well, 2 desegregation cases. In 1894, we get the first roots of the African American community in the Slate Belt. There are 30 names included in borough records, starting with Susan Hoff, age 17, who passed away in 1894 as a result of tuberculosis. The last recorded death was Beatrice Thornton, year unknown. The first recorded birth of an African American individual in the Slate Belt was Scott Sweet in 1896. Borough records are really the only place to find this information, since, for example, Mount Zion Church records have all been lost. Mount Zion Church, as one of the Black churches in the area, would have been one of the only other places that this sort of information could have been recorded. Also of interest within this time period, in 1899, the United Church Fraternity of the African American League met, which also included Slate Belt residents. E.S. Ray and Joseph E. Say of Bangor and C.T. Reeve and M.M. Cool of Penn Argyll were included in this. Interestingly enough, the United Church Fraternity of African American League was a predecessor of the NAACP. Of that former organization, W.E.B. Du Bois is the only person who was part of both organizations. During this time period, also, one of the most famous former residents of the Slate Belt lived, Mary Gertrude Smith Bodhi, also known as Sweet. The Smith family in general was one of the larger African-American families in the area. Mary Gertrude Smith Bodhi can be considered the most prominent member of the family, however. She was the first woman and first African-American graduate of East Stroudsburg University in 1904. Bodhi Smith was not born in the area, though she did spend most of her childhood and early adult years living in the area. Two of her siblings, however, were born in the area, and all three attended the East Bangor schools. Of interest with Smith Bodhi is that she was offered a job at the East Stroudsburg Teaching College following her graduation at East Stroudsburg University, and it was initially assumed she would accept and become the first African-American teacher there. However, instead she married her husband, Reverend Jacob Benjamin Bodhi, a reverend and widower from Nashville, North Carolina. Together they would have 15 children, 11 of which would survive to adulthood. Reverend Bodhi would die in 1936 and Smith Bodhi in 1941. However, at this point they had since moved away from the Slate Belt and were living in New Rochelle. The 11 surviving children had jobs that spanned from ministers, lawyers, a nurse, a college president, and an LA housing official. Drusilla Bodhi, one of the daughters, was a nurse. She was the first African-American to be part of the New Rochelle Nursing Association and an early member of the Federal Department of Health, where she served from 1942 through 1957. She was also the director of nursing at Hayden State University and later a supervisor of emergency service and outpatients at Sinai Hospital in Baltimore. Reverend J. Timothy Bodhi was another one of their children. However, for Smith Bodhi, he was one of her stepsons, the result of Reverend Bodhi's previous marriage. His wife was Emery M. Bodhi, who was a childhood friend of Alberta Williams King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother. Correspondence with Martin Luther King Sr. can be available through the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project. Charles E. Bodhi was another son, and he was the family biographer and author of A Giant in the Earth, the book concerning their father. Interestingly enough, one of Smith Bodhi's sons would live until 2015. One, Daniel W. Bodhi, who was a lawyer and the founder of the Westchester Black Bar Association. In fact, in 2007, Daniel Bodhi would in fact hand out a scholarship dedicated to his mother that was started in 1986 at East Stroudsburg University, demonstrating how important she was to the university's history. Now, to return to the Slate Belt proper. The early community seemed to have faded by the mid-20th century, which could explain the missing documents that I previously mentioned. Early major families in the early 20th centuries were the Depps, Winkies, Smith, Roses, and Penns. The Roses and Mount Zion Baptist Church, of which the only reverend was Isaac Rose. Presumably with his death, there was no population left to serve the church, and thus the church was closed with his death. Reverend Rose lived at what was at the time known as Enward Hill. The Winkie family lived on Shocktown Road in Penn Argyl. John M. Winkie served in World War I, eventually earning a commissioned officer's position. He started out as a non-commissioned officer, worked up his ranks, and was eventually sent to officer's school after impressing his superiors. However, by the time of John M. Winkie's death, most of his family had moved out of the area. He died in 1960 and was buried in Fairview Cemetery. His wife, Eleanor Penn Winkie, died at age 104 in Fountain Hill on December 21st, 2003. George Linwood Shabby Flood was another resident of the area at the time. He was the first African-American to participate in many sports in East Stroudsburg University. He was well liked by his teammates to the point of when he was denied service at a restaurant, they also refused to then eat at the restaurant and left. Flood was the fourth vice president of the American Brotherhood of Slate Workers, which was in fact an international organization. It was based out of Penn Argyl, which also helps demonstrate just how important the Slate Belt was to the overall international slate industry. However, that's not to say everything was great within the Slate Belt. For much of the mid-20th century, the KKK was active in the area, and in 1928, we have records of a cross burning. However, whether it was aimed at the African-American community or the Jewish community in the area is unclear, or it could have also been aimed at the Catholic community, which had steadily been moving more and more into the area. Former Slate Belt Heritage Center President Lou Bray is familiar with the prejudice that had been in the area, but has chosen not to go too in depth, but likely because some of the people he remembers as being prejudiced are still alive in the present time. One person he did discuss was Caroline Massey, a graduate of Penn Argyl High School. She worked at Martin's Guitar, and her sister Eleanor married Clarence Bloodworth. A specific situation that former President Lou Bray could remember was when the students at Penn Argyl were offered internships one summer. Caroline Massey was the only one who was denied one. Thankfully, one was found for her at the toy factory, which had Jewish owners. The Jewish community and the African-American community were long close in the area. For example, the Murray family, which moved into the area during the mid-20th century, founded the Hillside Inn with the Kaufman family. However, the Kaufman family would sell their shares to them just prior to the opening, following the death of Abraham Kaufman. Eventually, the Hillside Inn would be known as the Murray Pocono Estates in Hillside Country Village. It would shut down in 2005. However, long before that, neighbors would try to make the inn shut down, including putting up for sale signs on the property when obviously the Hillside Inn was not for sale, and police frequently raided the inn, claiming indecent action. The Bloodworth family is one of the remaining families from the mid-20th century. Clarence and Edward Bloodworth moved into the area in the mid-1940s. Clarence Duke Bloodworth, who is still a resident of the area and runs Duke Sporting Goods, along with sister Renee, who no longer lives in the area, agreed to be interviewed for this book. Clarence Bloodworth, brother of Edward Bloodworth, was in fact instrumental in getting the family to move to the area, following him working in Philadelphia after World War II. Prior to that, the Bloodworth family lived in Fort Worth, Texas. Edward and Clarence Bloodworth originated in a small town in Texas called Lockhart. Eventually, however, they would move to Fort Worth, Texas, where they would start their families. Edward and Clarence Bloodworth were born in Texas and started their families there. They wouldn't move into the Pennsylvania Slate Belt area until the mid-1940s, in which Clarence was in fact the one to encourage their families to move up into the area. Edward Bloodworth was the father of Clarence Duke Bloodworth and Renee Bloodworth. Edward Bloodworth would have had two children. Two of Edward Bloodworth's children were the aforementioned Duke and Renee. Duke Bloodworth would found the Duke Bloodworth, the last remaining Bloodworth in the area, owns Duke Sporting Goods. Both of his children, Scott and Amy, have since moved out of the area. Renee also moved out of the area and is now a nurse and home health administrator in is a home health administrator in a nationwide health provider. She has rather aptly moved back to Lockhart, Texas, where her family first started. Much like her brother, she has two children, in this case, two daughters, Jody and Clarissa. Much like how their children were successful, so too were Clarence and Edward Bloodworth. Their Rolling Acres Hill Farm was very successful and existed until 1961. Edward and Clarence were also very successful, running the Rolling Acres Farm, which lasted until 1971. The farm was originally a dairy farm. However, following a case of brucellosis in 1961, they shifted over to being primarily a beef and herding farm. That is what they would remain until 1971. That is what the farm would remain until 1972, a year following Edward's death in 1971. Prior to that, Clarence Bloodworth had sold his share in the farm to Edward and opened a service station in Penn Argyl, which he would then run up until his death. It was impressive that both brothers and their children were so successful, especially in the mid to late 20th century when there were still issues of prejudice in the Slate Belt area. This can also in part be assumed by just how small the African-American community was at this point in time. Much larger communities existed in Easton and Bethlehem, which admittedly also have much larger populations. However, the percentage of the African-American population in comparison to the overall population of the Slate Belt versus the overall African-American population versus the overall population in Bethlehem and Easton is still in comparison very, very small. The African-American community, however, has been on the rise in the 21st century. Part of this is a result of the fact the Lehigh Valley and the Slate Belt have both become commuter residencies for people who work in the New York City area. This is because Pennsylvania has much lower taxes than either New Jersey or New York, and it is easy to get from the Slate Belt and Lehigh Valley to New York City via various transit companies and the much better highways that existed in the early, mid, and late 20th century. However, that is not to say that the communities are large and that to this day, they admittedly are still much smaller than every other minority group in the Slate Belt region. That is not to say that there are no new African-American owned businesses in the area. In May 2014 through May 2015, there existed the restaurant Three Measures in Bangor. It most likely due less than its African-American owners and more due to the rather small vegetarian community in the area. The African-American community in the Pennsylvania Slate Belt may be small, but it has always existed and it always will exist, as we can see through the course of history. It may be only one or two people, but those one or two people will always grow into more people. The African-American community in the Pennsylvania Slate Belt has always been small, but it has always been here, and it has always been a part of the history. Thank you for taking your time to watch this, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Have a good rest of your day.